When I talk to people about the idea of moving some of their funds to offshore banks, it can be a little scary at times. But in reality, the banks in your own country may be much worse off financially than some of the best banks offshore. That happens to be the case in the United States, where a recent article suggests that U.S. banks are a lot weaker than you might think. Hi, I'm Andrew Henderson here at Nomad Capitalist. My team of over 30 people, our network of global experts, and yours truly help 7- and 8-figure entrepreneurs legally go where they're treated best. More at nomadcapitalist.com. Here's the article from Bloomberg at the end of 2020. It goes like this. The largest U.S. banks are less healthy than they appear, boosted by temporary accounting and capital relief measures, as well as massive market support from the Federal Reserve, an advocacy group said. Although the 6 biggest banks' leverage ratios reported at the end of June 2020 averaged almost 2 percentage points above regulatory minimums, the actual average would have been only 84 basis points, a little under 1%, above without the relief measures, said Americans for Financial Reform in a report when the article came out. Regulators, the article continues, have allowed banks to delay the hit to their capital ratios from billions of dollars in loan loss provisions they've put aside this year. Just put it aside. Massive increases in their holdings of cash and treasuries are also temporarily excluded from the calculation of the leverage ratio, which has become the binding constraint for the largest banks during the pandemic. The Marcus Stanley, policy director from this group, Americans for Financial Reform, said, "We're not in a 2008 situation where major banks are facing collapse, but we're going into an uncertain future, and the big banks aren't in as good of shape as they appear. Even if the firms wouldn't be on the precipice of insolvency without the support measures, the allowances have let most banks continue paying dividends as well," says the advocacy group. So basically, the government is letting the banks continue on. They're not as solvent as you think. And, oh, that's not convenient. You don't want to share that. You don't want to put that in your numbers. That's fine. Now, I've been saying this for a long time. Obviously, you have other places to put money than cash. Obviously, many people who are watching this will say, you should put your money in cryptocurrency. You should put your money in gold or silver bars. And of course, those things have a place. I think if you're an entrepreneur, I think if you're an investor, I think having cash on hand for business opportunities, for hiring growth, for marketing growth, for acquisitions, for whatever the case may be, when there's something that you want to buy at a distressed price or an asset that you want comes along, I like to be able to pounce. And I understand you can sell your gold, you can sell your crypto. For me, I like having some money just sitting there. I like having a diverse portfolio. And so, would I keep my money in the United States? A lot of people call me from the US and they say, oh, we have the FDIC that insures our money. I talk to people from Australia and other Western countries. Is my money in these offshore banks going to be insured? And the simple answer is, in many cases, either no or not for as much. But here's the rub. This article is talking about U.S. banks, and every year, different publications put out a list of the safest banks in the world. I like to look at a report where they put out the 50 safest banks in the world. And in the last 5 or 6 years, with perhaps one exception, no U.S. retail bank has made the list. You will occasionally see some farm banks. I think there was one U.S. retail bank on the list a couple of years ago. But you are not seeing the main banks, the main U.S. banks that everyone knows, on the lists. Where are you seeing banks? Admittedly, you are seeing them in Australia and Canada, some of the countries that we help people from. Now, if you want to no longer pay taxes in Australia or Canada by moving overseas, you're not going to have access to those banks anymore. So you'll need to find a strong bank somewhere else. But for everyone else, if you're in the US, if you're in the UK, if you're pretty much anywhere else in the Western world or anywhere in the world, your banks probably aren't as safe as they appear. And what's interesting is when we do research on banks and we look into even some rather emerging countries, we'll look at reports from big accounting firms and others, and we'll look at the numbers behind the bank. And then we'll compare it to some of these banks, like in the US, the big names that everyone feels safe about, that they've been lulled into a sense of security about. Oh, if I keep my money in this big US bank, You can never go wrong. Now, I'm not saying that you're going to go wrong keeping your money in a U.S. bank, but I'm saying if your idea is my money is safe in Wells Fargo, then your money's going to be even safer in a bank in Singapore, in a bank in Switzerland. There are banks in the Middle East. There are banks all over the world. I think there's some banks in Panama that are safer than the U.S. You will see some countries on that list with banks that you wouldn't even imagine this country would have banks that are safer. And so, for me, this is a wake-up call. Back during the last recession, the global financial crisis, 08-09, they did a study. U.S. banks were 40th safest in the world. I believe the U.K. was 44th, if I remember correctly. 40th safest. Could most Americans even name 39 countries? 39 other countries that could remotely have safer banks. Now, you might say Austria or Switzerland or Liechtenstein, okay. But could you name all 39 of them? And so I think that, beyond just banking, this is a reminder that your country, I remember going into banks with my father. We'd go out for breakfast many Saturday mornings. And sometimes we'd go to the bank and we'd deposit a check or we'd, do whatever. And you'd go in and you'd see that big sign. If you're from the US or from other countries that have this, you'd see that big plaque on the teller's desk. Your deposits are insured by the FDIC. Back then it was $100,000. Now it's $250,000. Obviously, every year inflation reduces the amount that's actually insured. And of course, the FDIC has less than a penny for every dollar in there. If one of these big banks were to fail, they would have to figure something else out because they don't have enough money to pay everybody back. And so when you really go down the rabbit hole, you think to yourself, if things got really bad, if something like the pandemic caused a real shock to the system, would your money in these banks in the US be safe? Now again, are you going to keep all your money in the bank? No. Do you want some real estate, some gold, some crypto, all kinds of different assets, some stock, whatever? Sure. But if you're going to keep some money in the bank, this is why, once again, I suggest diversifying. I talk to some people who have 4 or 5 different bank accounts in the US because they figure, I'm under the FDIC limit, or they just like the idea of having 4 or 5 different banks. If you're going to manage 4 or 5 different banks, why don't you make 1 or 2 of them a legal offshore bank account where you get to choose the safest? It's not a matter of choosing a bank based on what was next door to your teenage ice cream parlor job. I actually had a teenage ice cream parlor job. It's not the bank that your employer uses for direct deposit and you just kind of begrudgingly went along. It's not the bank that they, signed you up for when you went to college. It's not the bank that your wife uses because she's a member of whatever. Why don't you make a conscious, intentional choice? Great word about what Nomad Capitalist is all about, intentional. Intentional choice to say, I'm going to go where I'm treated best with my cash, and I'm going to put the cash that I want to have in fiat currency available to me on demand in the bank that's most likely to return it. Not a bank that's relatively likely to return it. Not a bank that is convenient and I feel nice and warm and fluffy. This is what Nomad Capitalist is all about. You can go and look at the 12th, 13th, and I think 15th safest banks in the world. They are the big 3 banks in Singapore. Right. Now, not all the banks on that top 50 list are going to accept you if you're a non-resident. And so there's different strategies for everyone. Maybe you want to move to one of those countries and get a bank account in Switzerland. I've got a guy right now, he's moving to Switzerland and paying a low lump sum tax to live there. Maybe you want a bank in Singapore. Maybe you want a bank in the UAE. They actually make the list. So there are lots of countries with safer banks than your country, chances are. And so let's be intentional and say, I'm going to put some of my money in one of those banks and not go where I'm treated a little better. Not say, but I'm moving from one bank in my country to another bank because they gave me a free toaster or because they pay 10 basis points higher interest. The interest these days, it's not going to make a difference. Why don't you make an intentional choice to say, let me have the best? And I think once you start doing that and you start demanding the best, that leads to your demanding the best in other ways. You're going to start thinking, why don't I have the best passport? Why don't I have the best tax rate? Why don't I have the best regulatory climate for my business? For me, banking is an on-ramp for a lot of the things that we talk about here. U.S. banks, according to this group, according to Bloomberg, not as safe as you may think. It's a wake-up call. These banks are 84 basis points away from basically being in bad shape. And what is being reported, what's being told to people, just isn't quite true. This is an opportunity to go where you're treated best. I think everyone should have bank accounts overseas. If you're a US citizen or you live somewhere else where you have to report them, do that. Work with someone like Nomad Capitalist or an international accountant to make sure that you are in full compliance. But make sure that you're going where you're treated best with your money and not simply falling for warm, fuzzy feelings in a country where you feel safe, but probably isn't nearly as safe as you think. How can Nomad Capitalist help you? 4 ways. Number 1, subscribe to our channel and click the notification bell to make sure you get our new video every day. Number 2, get a copy of Nomad Capitalist, the book. You'll learn a lot of my personal experiences over a dozen years of studying this stuff, as well as exactly some of the strategies that you can use to build your Nomad Capitalist plan. Number 3, if you're not sure where to start, but you want to come and learn from my team and I, you want to come and mingle with like-minded people, learn more about our live conference, Nomad Capitalist Live. It's coming up soon. And number 4, if you want some help right now because you've got a burning issue, you need something solved, you want to lower your taxes, get a second passport, or build the Nomad Capitalist lifestyle of your dreams, go to nomadcapitalist.com and click on Become a Client.